The rejection of the Epstein files, the new support for Ukraine, the passing of tax cuts. Again, I think you're looking at something that is looking a little bit more traditional for the Republican Party.
Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. Today we're going to be talking about Donald Trump's increasingly tough rhetoric and positioning against Russia over the war in Ukraine, because yesterday Donald Trump made clear that he would be giving a 50-day deadline to Russia to achieve peace in Ukraine. He also talked about the new weapons that America will be providing for Ukraine, and threatened sanctions, large sanctions on trading partners of Russia. It's quite a dramatic change from the Donald Trump of 2023 and 2024 as far as Russia and Ukraine is concerned. And to discuss it, I'm delighted to be joined by Sergey Radchenko, who is in Dublin, but he is in fact a professor at Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C., and here in London by the deputy editor of the Spectator in America, Kate Andrews. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, Freddie.
Sergey, I'll start with you. I mean, obviously everybody's calling this a U-turn from Donald Trump, given that he initially seemed to be very friendly, well-disposed towards Putin if Putin was willing to give him a peace deal. That has changed quite dramatically, hasn't it, over the last few months?
Well, it has to some extent. We've had a number of telephone conversations between Trump and Putin. The last one between them took place on July 3rd, which did not go well, according to Trump. Trump called it bad. Mark Rutte, talking about this telephone conversation, said that Trump was irritated by Putin's non-response, Putin's seeming intention to continue the war. And so now we've had 2 weeks that have passed since then, almost 2 weeks, Trump has made increasingly more militant statements about Russia, saying that he's just tired of Putin, etc. And of course, yesterday we had that press conference with Mark Rutte in the White House, where Trump said that new weapons would be going to Ukraine, and then he also threatened the so-called secondary tariffs. I would say the secondary tariffs part is not as important, especially that there is a 50-day deadline, so to speak. Putin has to effectively agree to ceasefire within 50 days, or countries that trade with Russia would face secondary tariffs. But I don't think that is as important as the other part of the promise, and that is to provide mainly NATO allies. In fact, NATO allies would be provided with weapons which they could then send on to Ukraine, and that includes Patriots, which are absolutely essential to keep Ukraine's skies free from Russian missiles, but also ammunition and also missiles to hit inside Russia as well.
To what extent is this Trump, who seems to always be looking for peace by various, sometimes even warring means, to what extent is this him realizing that as he pressured Putin to try and get a peace deal done earlier in the year, he realized that Putin knew that he's winning the war, essentially, and that Ukraine didn't have a lot of leverage, for want of a better term, and that now he has to provide Ukraine with enough military firepower to give Ukraine leverage in peace talks with Putin?
Well, in many ways, this is what a lot of people have been saying all along, that the only way you can actually bring Putin to the negotiating table is to provide weapons to Ukraine, is to apply pressure on Moscow for whatever reasons. And, I don't want to speculate why, but Trump did not seem to think that way early on. And now he understands, after all that diplomacy that he had dispatching Steve Witkoff to Moscow, multiple conversations with Putin, he must have understood that this is the way to get things done, i.e. to provide Ukraine with weapons and see if Ukraine acquires greater leverage to actually get Putin to talk seriously about peace. So I think that's a learning curve. It's a learning process. I don't think Trump himself is very keen on seeing this war continue. We know that he doesn't want this war. He wants out of this war. But one thing that he has done now, which has been which is something a lot of people have been hoping he would do, is he has promised American weapons, which are essential, very, very important for Ukraine. He has promised to deliver those weapons, if not directly to Ukraine, but through allies, through NATO allies, and of course the Europeans will end up paying for this. But at least he understands that this is a way to give Ukraine the sort of leverage that it would require to have real negotiations with Russia.
Kate, we've come a long way, haven't we, since the famous Oval Office scene with Vladimir Zelensky, when Trump famously said, you don't have the cards. Here we have Donald Trump trying to give Ukraine some cards, it seems.
Yes, we have come a long way, although there is a similarity, although it's playing out in a very different, less public way, which is that Donald Trump seems to be at his wits' end with this war. Of course, he promised his base, he promised the country he was going to end it in 24 hours. I think even the people who recognize that as being an exaggeration at the time still feel like perhaps he's taken his eye off the ball when it comes to this. He's obviously been looking at other countries, such as Iran. And it's interesting to talk about whether or not this is a U-turn, because I think for his base, where he's going to have the biggest problem, it is. I think for others, it looks like the president's on a journey. And for many people, they think, well, why did it take you so long to get here, to realize that maybe Vladimir Putin isn't acting in good faith when he talks to you on the phone. A quote stuck out for me in the BBC interview that Donald Trump gave overnight, where he said, we'll have a great conversation. He's talking about Vladimir Putin. I'll say that's good. I'll say I think we're close to getting it done. And then he'll knock down a building in Kyiv. Well, Putin's been knocking down buildings in Kyiv, to put it very, very lightly, and targeting a lot of civilians for years now, including in the time that President Trump has been trying to encourage peace. So I think for many Americans, they're thinking, especially those, perhaps more from a neoconservative background, are thinking, well, at least he's finally getting there. What's interesting, I think, is the reaction from his base. For this kind of change in Donald Trump's demeanor towards Putin to happen so quickly after he has bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, I think there are going to be a lot of people in the MAGA base who were really bought into this idea from Donald Trump, that there wasn't going to be any of this. Now, sure, Trump has not put American boots on the ground. This is very different than previous incidents and wars that America has got itself involved in. But I think there is really a growing question as to what Donald Trump's foreign policy really is. I think you can quite convincingly now, especially after the past 24 hours, make a fairly compelling argument that this is pretty traditional, realpolitik, Republican policy. I guess the difference with Donald Trump is you never know if he's going to stick to it. And if he does think that Putin is going to start playing ball, I'm sure we'll get more comments about, like we've had in the past, about how great Donald Trump thinks he is, and this, all the flatteries that he tends to dish out to what many people see as very serious opponents. But it is starting to feel a little traditional. And I think we are going to have to watch very closely how his voters and the people who love him the most react to that.
Interesting. Sergey, Kate mentioned Iran there, and it seems to me that Trump's focus actually in foreign policy in recent months has really been Iran. And it was interesting, a lot of those phone calls that he had with Putin, the readouts and so on, and Trump's responses afterward, particularly on Truth Social, would be to talk about Iran and how Putin's going to try and help him on Iran and so on. It seems there's some disappointment at the highest levels of the White House with the fact that Putin perhaps didn't help in the way that Trump wanted on Iran, and that has turned Trump against Putin when it comes to Ukraine, which he now can turn his attentions to, because in his mind, if perhaps not in everyone else's, the Iran issue has been parked or solved for now.
Well, I think the issue of Iran was one where Putin actually was willing to play some sort of a mediating role. He offered this a number of times to President Trump during their conversation, saying that he had, special experience in this regard. But what we have seen from Trump, even in those conversations, as reported by Trump himself later in his various posts, is that he told Vladimir Putin that, we don't want your mediation here. Solve the Ukraine problem, i.e., mediate that problem for yourself. You're the one fighting this war. And so that did not really work out. That is an area where Putin thought he would have leverage and a point of pressure against Trump, or at least a way of enticing him into giving Russia more concessions. Because look, you need Russia for this, for Iran, you need Russia for, I don't know, trade, etc. But Trump did not buy into this. So I think if there's disappointment in the way this worked out, I think it's disappointment on Putin's part that he could not bait Trump with this particular issue.
And Kate, let's go back to that issue of the MAGA base and Trump increasingly disappointing them on various fronts. First of all, with the bombing of Iran, which upset a lot of the people who voted for him, thinking that he was going to end foreign entanglements. But also there was the Epstein files, which is a sort of neuralgic point of interest to a lot of his voters. And now this, Marjorie Taylor Greene has said, we hate it. In response to Trump's announcement he was going to provide weapons for Ukraine. Steve Bannon thinks this is extremely dangerous and America's involving itself in a conflict that could escalate to a nuclear exchange and so on. With Trump, it's always interesting to what extent his movement is his own. Mm-hmm. Without Donald Trump, does Trumpism have a coherent enough movement to actually break away from him if he continues to disappoint them?
I think so long as Donald Trump is president of the United States and in charge of the Republican Party, Donald Trump controls MAGA. Once Donald Trump steps away and his term is over, there is a massive question as to whether or not MAGA really can exist without Donald Trump, or whether or not these very strong personalities that you've just mentioned will continue to shape the party if his vice president, J.D. Vance, wants to continue to shape the specific MAGA movement, or if that will move into something new and something different. I do suspect the latter. I think it's near impossible to disentangle Donald Trump from the MAGA movement. But I think what Trump perhaps has sometimes underestimated is how much even those very strong personalities have bought into what he sold. They bought into the idea that Americans won't pay the tariffs. They bought into the idea that there will be absolutely no need for American intervention anywhere else in the world. They bought into things he sold very, very strongly. And then when Trump has to look at the world and go, guys, it's a bit more nuanced than this. I'm going to delay these tariffs that we're seeing the stock market crash. I am going to go after Iran's nuclear facilities. We don't want irrational actors to get the bomb. It is somewhat unsurprising, actually, that people go, well, wait a second, you promised us something else. I do think the timing of this is interesting now that he is returning to Ukraine and Russia. It comes after Iran. It also comes after he passed his big, beautiful bill. I think Donald Trump was probably expecting a little more praise than he actually got. That ended up being a massive fight within his own party to get the bill across the line, as those who would ascribe to Elon Musk's deep disappointment about the debt ceiling and never-ending spending did fight Donald Trump hard to stop it from going through. And I'm not sure he's got as much response from his base as he would like for that, because what he's done is he's enshrined tax cuts from years back. Yes, there are some new tax cuts, including taxes around tips, but he may not be getting the praise he wanted. And then so quickly after that, as you say, Freddie, the Epstein files comes into the forefront. Again, it's a big issue for his base, partly because Trump made it so, but it is a big issue for his base. And he's sending out Donald Trump's asking a lot of questions at the moment. He's sending out on True Social genuine questions to his base, like, why are you so upset about this? Why are you so angry at my administration? He doesn't really get it. Similar in this BBC interview, I don't understand Putin's thinking. And you're almost getting some real-time insights from the president, who kind of thought maybe he had a grasp on what his supporters thought and what he thought the strongmen around the world thought. And now he's thinking, Trump would never phrase it this way because, of course, according to Donald Trump, he is all-knowing and all the rest of it. But really, you're seeing somebody struggle with the fact that they can't pull the strings all the time. And the fact that he's decided to send more weapons to Ukraine, I mean, that is obviously a massive change from Donald Trump's perspective. But, the rejection of the Epstein files, the new support for Ukraine, the passing of tax cuts, again, I think you're looking at something that is looking a little bit more traditional for the Republican Party. I don't want to overstate that. There's nothing really traditional about Donald Trump. But we did see this in his first term, too. The fact that, he spoke a certain way, he would act a certain way online, but then he would govern in a fairly traditional manner. I think ICE and the immigration raids and things like that remain a very big break with the Republican Party we knew before. But in these other areas, you are seeing those similarities.
Sergey, I wonder what you think of that, because perhaps this is a reflection of it doesn't matter as much as people think when a presidency changes, when an American president changes, even if it's such a dramatic departure from the norm as Donald Trump, because certain things carry on. For instance, in Donald Trump's first term, he would have liked to have gotten out of Afghanistan, but he didn't. He pushed for it, but didn't do it. And then it ended up being Joe Biden that eventually did it. Presidents can't necessarily dictate foreign policy in the way they want.
I agree. I agree with Kate, what she said about how Donald Trump may be becoming a normal president. Of course, he will never be a normal president. We know that. But there are certain continuities in U.S. foreign policy that you simply cannot look away from. Their demands on the United States, that you cannot just shut your eyes to, including its leadership in the world, its leadership in NATO. What do you do? What do you do? Do you pull out from all of that, and like Steve Bannon would have wanted wanted the United States to do? I think Donald Trump understands the consequences of a reckless isolationist policy that this would have, and so he tends to, I think, listen to people who say, well, look, you have to be careful because there might be very, very serious consequences, and that in itself promotes a particular kind of policy which has been thought out through, from one administration to the next, to the next, to the next, because the questions are the same. And the means of addressing questions, by and large, remain the same. How do you stand up to a bull like Vladimir Putin? Do you just basically surrender and say, have whatever you want? Well, even Donald Trump cannot accept that, right? He doesn't want to go down in history as the president who surrendered to bully Vladimir Putin. And that, if the question is no, you don't surrender, well, in this case, then what do you have to do? If you have the world's strongest military, do you have the weapons to supply Ukraine that it keeps fighting Russia and so on? And I think the answers that are being suggested are by and large the same answers that the Biden administration would perhaps also suggest. And that's kind of interesting because, of course, President Trump repeatedly says how bad the previous administration was, that it was the worst in history, etc., etc. All the decisions were wrong. But now he's basically adopting some of the same policies that the Biden administration had adopted to deal with Vladimir Putin.
And a weapon that he has in his sort of diplomatic or internationalist arsenal is tariffs. And this is something we're seeing already that he's willing to apply. And regardless of whether it makes economic sense, it's certainly quite a strong tool. It's like sanctions plus that he can threaten countries with, and allies of countries he's trying to bend to his will, with the possibility of up to 500% tariffs if necessary.
So yes, this is one of those things that he threatened to do against Russia. Of course, we know that the bill has been languishing in Congress, the Lindsey Graham bill about slapping a 500% tariffs on countries that import Russian resources, Russian oil and gas and uranium and so on and so forth, which I always thought was highly unrealistic. How do you slap a tariff like this on, let's say, China, which already was in a tariff war with the United States, and we know that brought markets to the point of an utter meltdown until a solution was found. Well, now we have this renewal of the same rhetoric. Basically, President Trump is now saying, never mind the Lindsey Graham bill, but he's saying, look, if Putin continues the war, then in 50 days he will slap tariffs on countries that import Russian oil and gas. And of course, with regard to oil and gas, the biggest importer in the world of Russia's stuff is China. So the question then comes to this. Will the Chinese say, oh, okay, well, in this case, we're not going to import Russian oil and gas? And to me, the answer is not so obvious, because I think this would be the kind of pressure the Chinese are very likely to resist, actually. So it's not clear that this will work with the Chinese. Will this work with other importers exporters of Russian natural resources. In particular, India is crucial here. India and Turkey are the next ones, right, in terms of the quantity of being imported. And the Indians have said previously, well, if you don't want us to import this oil, then you know what, we'll have to import it from the Middle East, and that will drive up the prices of oil, and that's not good for you either. So there are lots of complexities here which we have not been able to resolve in the last 3 years. Of course, it's in everybody's interest that Russia does not manage to earn cash from the export of oil and gas, but so far it has been able to do that, and of course it's using that money to wage its war in Ukraine. I'm not sure that the latest measure that Trump has announced is going to actually produce a very different result.
Kate, I'm going to give you an opportunity to be rude about tariffs again.
Thanks,
which
Fred.
I know you'll take.
That's so generous of you.
Sergey makes a very good point there that sanctions are historically, I would say, a very ineffective way of getting what you want on the international stage. Using tariffs as a kind of sanction is likely to be similarly as ineffective, because people always find ways around it, and it's the population of a country, not the government, that suffers usually when you impose those sorts of measures.
Yes, we did a cover for the Spectator a couple of years ago looking at how the sanctions against Russia were actually working, and the picture was very, very mixed. Russia was pretty resilient to the sanctions that the world had put on the country for its attack on Ukraine. I think that the point about oil made there is so important as well. Donald Trump in particular cares so much about keeping energy costs low, especially going into the midterm elections next year, where the price of oil is, how much it's costing to fill up your tank. These are questions that are pertinent and at the top of the list when it comes to President Trump. So he's going to have to think about the backlash in a way that I don't think he really was thinking about it back in April, when he felt on top of the world and thought he could put tariffs on any country he pleased. I maintain, and again, let's keep the economics roughly to the side of this. I do think tariffs are incredibly bad for Americans as well as the rest of the world. But I think politically speaking, and certainly from a geopolitical perspective, when Donald Trump blinked and decided to delay the tariffs because of the market reaction, worldwide, certainly in the States, and then delayed them again this month, I think he signaled to all of these countries, China included, Russia included, that when Trump makes certain kinds of economic threats, it means less than perhaps it once did. So not only do I think it may not have the effect that Trump wants to get Russia to play ball, I'm not sure the extent to which people believe him anymore. And you know, the first months of Donald Trump's second term in office have been a very curious mix of hard and soft power. It is not obvious to me that the White House fully understands its own balance and where it wants its balance to be. It has been using bombs, it has been using tariffs, it has been using the economy, it has been using phone calls, it's been using flattery, it's been using a bit of everything. And on Iran, the White House's perspective at the moment anyway is that it was a success. But on Russia and Ukraine, it clearly isn't a success. And given what the president promised, he's nowhere near success. And as those tensions rise, I don't think we can really say what the balance between hard and soft power is going to be here either. The fact that he is now going to supply weapons through NATO, and Trump is saying that's a win because Europe's going to pay and he loves it when other people pay, I still don't quite know which side they're going to fall down on.
And Sergey, let's close by going back to Ukraine. If, as you've argued, Trump has accepted now that he has to support Ukraine in order to give Ukraine some leverage, what do you think the ending now looks like? Is Ukraine now going to be in a better position to sue for peace? Because let's face it, we've been arming Ukraine for quite some time now. There have been several major U.S. investments in the Ukraine war effort, and they have not borne fruit. I mean, are we just prolonging another endless war here, or are we seeing an opportunity for peace emerging?
So we have to be realistic here. When we're talking about providing patriots to Ukraine, what are we talking about here? We're talking about Ukraine's ability to shoot down incoming Russian missiles. Why is this important? Because Russia has been shooting missiles in Ukraine in order to cripple its military and, in particular, energy infrastructure as we move into next winter period. So having more patriots will allow Ukraine to persist, to basically tell Vladimir Putin that his strategy has not been successful. Now, does it mean that he will stop sending missiles, launching missiles at Ukraine in order to try to overwhelm the Ukrainian air defenses? I don't think it means that at all, but it does send a certain signal over the longer term that, look, Ukraine is still going to be able to shoot down those missiles. Of course, on both sides, it's actually a very expensive undertaking, this missile war and the counter missile war. What about ammunition, or let's say ATACMS, and that the United States will now likely supply Ukraine with? Those are missiles that can strike targets inside Russia, including inside Russia, up to 300 kilometers. And that is not, it's not going to win the war for Ukraine. That's very clear. What it's going to do is it's going to raise the cost for Vladimir Putin as he continues to fight this war. And of course, we also have to keep in mind that Russian economy is not doing particularly well. So there are all these factors that Ukraine, a well-armed Ukraine, is going to be much more difficult to swallow. There's also the factor of Russian economy. As we move out of the summer season and we move towards winter, when nobody actually progresses during the winter in any case, then there's a real possibility that Vladimir Putin will calculate that perhaps the time has come to actually have a genuine negotiation. Now, will he calculate that? This is the $64,000 question, because you might say that Putin is just obsessed about having Ukraine, which Trump, as Trump says, it's the apple of his eye. He wants Ukraine, and he will not compromise, and he will drive Russia into poverty and into mud in order to achieve this goal. Well, in this case, this will continue for a long time. But I think we should also be open to the possibility that, given the mounting costs and the potential meltdown of the Russian economy, that Putin will actually consider genuine negotiation. But he hasn't so far, and we have to be clear about it.
Sergey and Kate, thank you very much indeed for coming on to Americano.